The bartender is pouring the fourth round of mimosas when Chelsea taps her glass with a spoon and says she has an announcement, and I already know what she's going to say before she says it. Because I have heard these exact words before, in this exact cabana, with this exact ocean glittering behind her, like it doesn't know what's about to happen to me. To Grandma Eleanor, Chelsea says, and she is not my grandmother. She was never anyone's grandmother. She was my mother. And Chelsea knows that. She has always known that, and she says it anyway because it gets a laugh from the bridesmaids who never met her. For finally being useful, turns out dead weight pays for a really, really good weekend. The bridesmaids laugh. Somebody's cousin, a stranger to me, raises her glass and says, "Iconic," like it's a compliment. And I sit there in a rented white cabana chair in Cabo San Lucas with a mimosa sweating in my hand, and I watch my stepsister toast to my mother's sapphire ring, the one she sold to a pawnbroker 3 weeks ago for $4,000 to cover the deposit on this exact trip, and I feel the specific, singular vertigo of living through a moment for the second time. Because I have done this before. I have sat in this chair. I have heard this toast. I know that in 11 seconds, Chelsea is going to look at me and say, "Oh, don't make that face. It's not like you were wearing it." And I know that in 4 minutes, I am going to excuse myself to the bathroom and cry into a hand towel embroidered with someone else's initials. And I know that 6 weeks from now, I'm going to be estranged from my entire family. And I know that 14 months from now, I'm going to be dead. I know all of this because it already happened to me once. This is the second time I am living through my mother's ring being sold to fund my stepsister's bachelorette party. The difference is that this time, the ring in that pawn shop case wasn't real. This time, I buried the real one 3 months ago in a small, lead-lined box beside my mother's headstone, exactly where she asked me to put it the week before she died, and exactly where I should have put it the first time before I let my family talk me out of it, before I let them convince me that keeping it in the family meant keeping it in Diane's fireproof safe, where anyone with the combination could reach it. This time, I know something they don't. I know exactly how this story ends because I already wrote the first draft, and I'm not making the same mistakes twice. But to understand why I'm sitting in this cabana smiling instead of screaming, you need to understand how the first version of my life went. You need to understand what it cost me the first time I found out. My mother's name was Eleanor. She raised me alone after my father left when I was 6, and when I was 16, she married a man named Gerald, a quiet, agreeable accountant who I liked well enough, mostly because he made her laugh again. Gerald came with a daughter from his first marriage, Chelsea, who was 13 and resented me on sight for reasons I never fully understood, and eventually stopped trying to. And Gerald came with a girlfriend-turned-fiancé named Diane, a woman who had been divorced twice before she met him and who treated every room she entered like she was auditioning to own it. My mother never fully trusted Diane. She used to say it quietly after Diane left the room, in that dry voice she reserved for things she wasn't going to make a big deal out of, but wanted me to remember anyway. That woman counts other people's blessings like they're hers to spend. I didn't understand what she meant until years later, when I watched Diane do exactly that, with exactly my mother's things. The ring itself came from my mother's grandmother, a woman named Josephine who had been born in 1911 and had somehow, against every historical headwind a woman of her generation faced, ended up owning a small jewelry store in Ohio. The sapphire was cornflower blue, cushion cut, set in white gold with 2 small diamonds flanking it, and it had been passed down through 3 generations of women in my family. Always to the daughter, always with the same instruction attached to it like a second stone. Keep it close, don't let it become anyone's inheritance but your own. My mother wore it every day of my childhood. I used to spin it around her finger while she read to me, the metal warm from her skin. When she got sick, the ring got looser and looser on her thinning hand until she had it restrung on a chain and wore it around her neck instead, tucked under her collar, close to her heart in the most literal way there is. 6 days before she died, she took it off the chain and put it in my palm and closed my fingers around it with both of her hands, which, by then, were mostly bone. "I mean this," she said, and her voice had gone thin the way the rest of her had, but her eyes were exactly as sharp as they'd always been. "Don't let this become a family conversation. Don't let anyone talk you into sharing it, storing it, insuring it together, any of that. It's yours. If something ever happens to you before you have a daughter of your own to give it to, I want it buried with me. Not sold, not fought over. Buried. Do you understand?" I told her I understood. I did not, in fact, understand. Not really. not until I had lived the consequences of not listening to her closely enough. I think about those growing up years more now than I used to, turning them over like the sapphire itself, looking for the exact moment the trajectory was set. There was the Thanksgiving when I was 17 and Diane rearranged the seating chart my mother had made, moving me from beside my own mother to a folding chair at the end near the kitchen door and called it mixing things up. There was the summer Chelsea borrowed my car for a week without asking and returned it with a cracked taillight she never mentioned, and when I brought it up, Diane told me I was being petty over a piece of plastic in front of the whole table. None of it on its own was a crime. All of it together over a decade was a pattern, and I had spent that decade the way most people spend patterns like that, telling myself each individual instance was too small to be worth the fight, until the sum of all those small surrenders became a kind of training, teaching everyone involved, myself included, exactly how much of me could be taken before I'd say anything at all. She died on a Tuesday in March in a hospital room with pale green walls and a window that looked out over a parking garage, and I held her hand until it stopped being warm. I was 29 years old. I had a rented apartment across town, a job doing accounts receivable for a regional insurance company, and precisely nobody left in the world who would call me first with good news or bad. The funeral was small. Diane organized most of it, which I was grateful for at the time because grief had turned my brain into wet cardboard and I could not have picked out a casket if my life depended on it. Gerald cried more than I expected him to. Chelsea, 25 by then and recently engaged to a man named Grant, whose family owned a chain of car dealerships across 3 counties, wore black and looked, if I'm honest, mildly inconvenienced, the way you look when a work meeting runs long. It was 3 weeks after the funeral that I made the decision that in my first life, I never fully understood the size of until it was much too late to undo it. I was moving. My lease was up, the new apartment wasn't ready for another 5 weeks, and I had roughly 9 boxes of my mother's things, including furniture too large to fit in a storage unit without paying for a bigger one than I could afford on an accounts receivable salary. Gerald offered his garage. He offered it kindly, the way he offered everything, apologetically, like he was worried I'd say no and he'd have failed at something. Diane, standing behind him in the kitchen doorway, added that of course they'd take good care of everything. It's family. And smiled at me in a way I mistook at the time for warmth. I said yes. I put 9 boxes and my mother's dresser and a steamer trunk of old photographs into their garage, and I put the ring on a chain around my own neck and I told myself it was fine, temporary, 5 weeks. What could happen in 5 weeks? In my first life, I did not check on those boxes even once during those 5 weeks. I was working double shifts to cover the security deposit on my new place, and grief had made me both exhausted and strangely easy to reassure. When Diane texted photos of Chelsea's bridal shower and casually mentioned she'd gone through a couple of your mom's boxes looking for the good tablecloths, "Hope that's okay," I said. Of course, sure, no problem. Because I was hollowed out and functioning on autopilot, and it did not occur to me, not once, that anyone would go looking for anything else. The ring stayed around my neck the whole time. That part, at least, I did right the first time. What I did wrong was leaving a small quilted jewelry box in with the rest of the estate items, a box that had belonged to my mother and that I had, in my exhaustion, forgotten contained her second best pieces, a pearl brooch from her own mother, a gold bangle, and an appraisal document, laminated, that Josephine had commissioned in 1987 for insurance purposes, stating the sapphire ring's estimated value along with a black and white photograph of the ring itself, clipped to the paperwork because Josephine had been a careful woman who liked things documented. Diane found that appraisal while going through the box for the tablecloths. She did not find the ring because the ring was around my neck, but she found proof that a ring matching that description existed and was worth, according to the 1987 valuation adjusted informally in a note Josephine had scrawled in the margin years later, easily 5 figures now, don't let anyone tell you different. I did not know any of this had happened until 4 months later, at Chelsea's bachelorette party in Cabo, when she raised a mimosa and made a joke that took me a full 90 seconds to understand, because my brain simply refused to assemble the pieces fast enough. It was Diane, finally, rolling her eyes at my confusion, who spelled it out for me in front of 6 bridesmaids and a rented cabana. "Oh, don't be dramatic," Diane said. We found some old jewelry of your mother's in one of the boxes, a ring that matched something in an appraisal paper. Costume stuff, honestly, we weren't even sure it was real. And Chelsea needed help covering the deposit for this trip, so I had it looked at and it turned out to actually be worth something. So we sold it. It was just sitting in a box, sweetheart. Nobody was wearing it. It wasn't doing anyone any good gathering dust. I said, stupidly, I have the ring. I have been wearing it since the funeral. There was a silence, the kind that has a texture to it, and then Diane's face did something complicated, landing somewhere between confusion and irritation, and she said, well, there was clearly a second one then because the jeweler confirmed the one we sold was a genuine sapphire, cushion cut, white gold, 2 accent diamonds. Matched the appraisal exactly. Maybe your mother had too. She had not had two. There was only ever one ring in my family, passed from Josephine to my great-aunt to my mother to me, a single object with 100 years of women's hands worn into its band. What Diane had found and sold was not some old jewelry. It was the exact ring described in that appraisal, minus the ring itself, which meant someone had done more than stumble across a box. Someone had gone looking, matched a photograph to a description, and either found a second piece I never knew existed or... And this was the possibility that kept me up at 3 in the morning for weeks afterward. Commissioned a replica made specifically to match my mother's ring, using the exact appraisal photo Diane had found, and sold that. I never fully proved which one it was. That is the truth of my first life. I never got the proof because I was too devastated to be methodical, and because every time I tried to raise the question again, my family closed ranks with the practiced unity of people who had clearly discussed their story in advance. You're being paranoid, Chelsea told me 3 days after we got home from Cabo in a phone call I took sitting on the floor of my new, still half-unpacked apartment. Dad said it's fine. Diane said it's fine. Why are you the only one making this a whole thing? Because it's my mother's ring, I said. Because she told me to bury it with her. Because I've been wearing what I thought was the real one this entire time, and now I don't even know. God, you're so obsessed with being the sad one, Chelsea said and hung up. That was the sentence that broke something in me. Not the sale, not the joke at the party. That sentence, delivered by a woman I had shared a bathroom with for 6 years of my adolescence, who I had covered for during 2 separate curfew violations, who I had once driven 4 hours in a snowstorm to bring home from a college she'd been too drunk to leave safely. You're so obsessed with being the sad one. I called my father, my actual father, the one who'd left when I was 6, for the first time in 8 years after that phone call, some desperate reflex looking for a family member who might, for once, take my side without a script. He listened for about 4 minutes, told me it sounded like a misunderstanding, and asked if I'd seen his new boat on Facebook. I never called him again after that either. It occurred to me, sitting on my kitchen floor afterward, that I had now been failed by both halves of my family in the same calendar year, which felt less like a coincidence and more like a verdict. I spent the next year trying to get anyone in that family to admit what had happened. Gerald wouldn't discuss it, said it was between the two of you, and disappeared into his study every time I brought it up. Diane produced a receipt from a pawnbroker showing a sale for $4,100, dated the week before the Cabo trip, for 1 sapphire and diamond ring, white gold, estate piece. A receipt that proved a sale had happened and proved absolutely nothing about which ring had been on the other end of it. Chelsea stopped answering my texts entirely after the wedding, which happened 7 months after the Bachelorette party. A lavish affair at a vineyard that Grant's family paid for almost entirely, except for the $4,000 of incidentals that Diane had, according to a slip of the tongue Gerald made at the rehearsal dinner, helped cover, thank God, because the deposits alone would have wiped us out. I was not invited to be a bridesmaid. I was invited to the wedding itself, seated at table 11, near the kitchen doors, next to a second cousin of Grant's I had never met. I went. I don't fully know why I went, except that some small, stubborn part of me still hoped that if I showed up, if I kept being present, someone would eventually look at me and feel something like shame. Nobody did. I sat at table 11 and watched Chelsea dance her first dance in a dress that cost more than my mother's entire funeral, and I thought about the sapphire ring, real or fake, wherever it had ended up, and I felt something in my chest that I would later learn, far too late, had a name. Takotsubo cardiomyopathy, broken heart syndrome, a real and documented medical condition in which prolonged severe emotional stress floods the heart with stress hormones until the muscle itself temporarily deforms, weakens, sometimes fatally. I didn't know that was happening to me. I just knew I was tired in a way sleep didn't fix. I knew I'd stopped being able to eat a full meal without my chest going tight. I knew I saw my doctor twice that year and mentioned some stress, some fatigue, and was told to try to relax. And I didn't correct her because by then relaxing felt like an insult, a thing offered to people whose families hadn't hollowed them out and called it generosity. 14 months after the toast in Cabo, I collapsed in the break room at work on a Thursday, holding a mug of coffee I never got to drink. The paramedics said my heart had gone into an arrhythmia so severe that by the time it restarted in the ambulance on the third attempt, I was already gone in every way that matters. I remember, if remember is even the right word for what happens in that space, a kind of falling that wasn't frightening so much as final, like closing a book halfway through a sentence. And then I opened my eyes and I was 29 again, in my old apartment, 3 weeks after my mother's funeral, with 9 boxes stacked by the door waiting to go into Gerald's garage, and the ring warm around my neck on its chain, and a phone in my hand with a text from Diane, already halfway typed, offering the garage space kindly the way she always offered things when she wanted something from you later. I sat on the floor of that apartment for 11 straight minutes without moving, because I understood all at once and with total clarity what had just happened to me and what it meant and what I was now capable of doing differently. I did not cry. I want to be honest about that because I think people expect the moment of rebirth to be tearful, cathartic, a great emotional flood. It wasn't. It was quiet and cold and extremely clear, like waking up in a room you know the layout of so well you can navigate it in the dark. I knew every mistake I was about to make if I let myself make them again. I knew every lie Diane was about to tell me with a straight face. I knew down to the words what Chelsea would say to me on a phone call 18 months from now if I let this play out the same way. And I knew I wasn't going to let it. The first thing I did, before I texted Diane back, before I did anything else, was call a jeweler. Not the one my mother's family had always used, the one Diane knew about. The one whose number was written on a sticky note in my mother's old address book that Diane had definitely seen at some point over the years. A different one, 2 towns over. A small independent appraiser named Mr. Okafor, who I had, in my first life, only discovered existed after my mother's death, when I was trying, too late, always too late, to get an independent valuation of the ring to settle the argument once and for all. This time I called him 3 weeks after the funeral instead of 11 months after it. I brought him the ring, still on its chain, and I told him the truth, that it had significant sentimental and possibly significant monetary value, that I needed a full, dated, notarized appraisal with photographs, and that I also wanted to commission a high-quality replica, cubic zirconia in the same cut and setting, indistinguishable at a glance, for insurance and security purposes. His shop smelled like polishing compound and old velvet, and he worked with a loop screwed into one eye socket, turning the ring under a jeweler's lamp with the unhurried attention of a man who genuinely liked looking at beautiful things for a living. He didn't ask many questions. Jewelers who've been in the business 30 years rarely do. They've heard every family story there is, and mine on the surface sounded like ordinary caution. A grieving daughter protecting her inheritance. He photographed the ring from 6 angles, weighed it, examined the stone under magnification, and confirmed what I already knew. A genuine old-cut sapphire, high clarity, historically significant setting, current appraised value just north of $11,000, considerably more than the $4,100 it had sold for the first time around, which told me something ugly and useful. That whoever sold it the first time either hadn't gotten it properly appraised or hadn't cared to because they weren't selling a treasure. They were solving a short-term cash problem and grabbing whatever number got them there fastest. "You'd be surprised how often I see this," he said, sliding the loop up onto his forehead and finally looking at me directly. "Family peace, somebody grieving, somebody else deciding grief is a good time to make a withdrawal." I asked him if he meant that literally, whether he'd actually seen cases like mine before, and he shrugged in a way that told me he had, more than once, and that he'd learned a long time ago not to get involved beyond the paperwork. I didn't hold that against him. I just made a note, privately, that I intended to get involved a great deal further than he ever would, and that his honesty on the receipt, when the moment came, would matter more than he could possibly know yet. The replica took 6 weeks to complete. In the meantime, I did something I had never once thought to do in my first life. I went to a lawyer. Not a divorce lawyer, not a criminal lawyer, just an ordinary estate attorney named Priya Anand, who my mother's oncologist had coincidentally recommended to me years earlier for reasons I'd never followed up on. I brought Priya my mother's will, which named me as sole heir to all jewelry, personal effects, and sentimental items belonging to the testatrix. And I brought her Josephine's original 1987 appraisal with the photograph clipped to it. And I asked her to help me formalize a personal property trust, a small, quiet legal instrument that would put the ring, specifically and by description, into a structure that only I could access, dissolve, or transfer, requiring my notarized signature for any change of possession. This is unusually thorough for a ring, Priya said, not unkindly, more curious than anything. It's not really about the ring, I told her, which was true in a way I didn't fully explain. It's about making sure nobody ever gets to decide on my behalf that something of my mother's is theirs to spend. She didn't push further. She drew up the paperwork in 10 days. I signed it in her office, notarized, witnessed, filed. The ring, the real one, now existed on paper entirely outside the reach of anyone's garage. We were just going through some boxes. Anyone's $4,000 bachelorette deposit. Then I did the thing that if you had told me a year earlier I would ever be capable of doing, I would not have believed you. I let them steal it anyway. Not the real one, the replica. When the 6 weeks were up and my new apartment still wasn't ready, I called Diane back and told her I'd love to take her up on the garage offer after all, and I packed the same 9 boxes, plus the same small quilted jewelry box that had started everything the first time. Pearl brooch, gold bangle, and this time, deliberately, carefully, the 1987 appraisal document with its black and white photograph, the exact bait that had drawn Diane's attention before. Except this time, tucked inside the same quilted box, sat the replica, cubic zirconia in white gold, indistinguishable to the naked eye from the ring it was built to imitate. I want to be clear about why I did this. I could have simply protected the real ring and left the replica out of it entirely. I could have declined the garage offer, rented my own storage unit, kept every single item away from that house. It would have been safer. It would also have taught Diane and Chelsea absolutely nothing and left them entirely unaccountable for what they'd done in my first life. Free to find some other vulnerable thing of mine to help themselves to eventually. Because I had learned the hard way, watching them for 29 years and then some, that people who take things from you once and get away with it clean rarely stop at once. So I gave them the bait, and I gave them exactly enough rope, and then I waited and I watched, this time with my eyes open the entire way through. Diane found the appraisal within 11 days, which I knew because she texted me, almost word for word what she'd said in my first life about going through some boxes for tablecloths. I said, sure, no problem, and felt nothing but a distant, focused calm. The way you feel watching a chess piece move exactly where you predicted it would. While I waited to see what she'd do with it, I did the other half of the work, the half that had nothing to do with the ring at all. In my first life, I had never looked closely at Gerald and Diane's finances because it wasn't my business, because grief had made me passive, because I trusted in the vague and unexamined way you trust people you've shared holidays with for a decade, that whatever was happening in that house was ordinary. This time, I remembered a detail from my first life that I had at the time barely registered. An offhand comment Gerald made at Chelsea's wedding rehearsal dinner about his retirement account taking a hit the year before, followed by a strange, tight look from Diane, a look I hadn't thought twice about at the time because I was too busy drowning in my own grief to notice anyone else's undercurrents. This time, I paid attention to that look before it even happened, because I already knew it was coming. I started spending time with Gerald again, more than I had in my first life, not because I'd forgiven anything, but because he was, and had always been, the softest and most honest point of entry into that household, a man who genuinely did not enjoy conflict and who, when asked simple, warm, unthreatening questions over coffee, tended to answer them. Over the following months, in pieces, across several unhurried conversations that I steered so gently, he never once felt steered, I learned that Diane had, over the prior 3 years, made a series of withdrawals from a joint retirement account Gerald had set up decades earlier, ostensibly for home repairs and helping Chelsea with the down payment on her condo. Withdrawals that Gerald had signed off on without reading closely because Diane handled all that financial stuff. She's so much better at it than I am. I learned that the actual total, which Gerald did not know because he had never added it up himself, came to just over $61,000 over 3 years, a figure I calculated privately from bank statements. Gerald guilelessly let me help him organize for tax season, never once suspecting that I was building a file. I also learned from a conversation with Chelsea's own maid of honor, a woman named Britt, who I'd always liked more than the rest of that bridal party, and who had no particular loyalty to keeping Diane's secrets, that the wedding itself, the one Grant's family was largely funding, had a complicated undercurrent. Grant's parents, old money, deeply concerned with appearances, had made it quietly known that they expected Chelsea's side to contribute meaningfully to at least some of the costs as a matter of pride and parity, and that Diane had been assuring them for months that our side is handling the incidentals. Incidentals that Britt said, laughing, apparently included like $4,000 of jewelry Diane found lying around, which, I mean, must be nice. I did not react to that the way I wanted to. I smiled and said something non-committal and went home and added it to the file. By the time the Bachelorette trip to Cabo came around again, 6 months into my second life, I had 3 things I hadn't had the first time: a notarized trust protecting the real ring, a folder of financial documents establishing exactly how much of Gerald's retirement Diane had quietly redirected, and a clear, corroborated understanding that Grant's family's approval of this marriage rested in part on an image of financial respectability that Diane had been actively lying to maintain. I also had one more thing, small but essential: Mr. Okafor's card, and an idea about what a jeweler with 30 years of experience might be willing to do for a client who'd paid him fairly and treated him honestly if that client asked a small, specific favor. The Bachelorette weekend in Cabo unfolded almost exactly the way it had the first time because I let it. Same rented villa, same cabana on the beach, same 6 bridesmaids, most of whom I'd met before and would never see again after this. Chelsea, tipsy on her second mimosa of the morning, decided, because Chelsea has always needed an audience for everything, and this time was no exception, that it would be so fun to have a jewelry appraiser friend of a friend, a woman named Sasha who did content for a jewelry resale app and had flown out for the trip, do a live Guess the Value segment for her Instagram using pieces the bridesmaids had brought along, culminating, because Chelsea could never resist a good story, in her holding up her own engagement ring alongside a photo of my future mother-in-law's heirloom sapphire that basically paid for this whole trip. Isn't that wild? I want to be honest, I did not orchestrate that particular moment. I did not need to. I'd simply made sure, months earlier in a casual conversation with Chelsea about wedding content ideas that I mentioned, almost in passing, how fun it would be if she ever did one of those appraise my jewelry videos, since everyone loved that kind of content. And Chelsea, who took credit for other people's ideas as easily as she took other people's rings, had apparently filed it away as her own inspiration. Sasha, the appraiser, held up the photo Chelsea had taken of the ring before it sold, because, of course, Chelsea had photographed it for the story, for the aesthetic, because everything in Chelsea's life had to be documented and captioned and said on camera, in front of 6 bridesmaids and a phone that was, at that exact moment, live streaming to Chelsea's 11,000 followers, that based on the photo alone she couldn't be certain, but that the cut and setting looked consistent with an estate piece, possibly quite valuable, and asked whether anyone had the actual paperwork on hand. Diane did. Diane, who had flown out for the mother of the bride portion of the weekend and who could never resist being the one with the answers, produced from her bag the pawnbroker's receipt, the one that said $4,100, and handed it over like a trophy, saying, on camera, "We had it appraised properly before we sold it, don't worry." Sasha read the receipt out loud. It listed the purchasing pawnbroker's name, a shop I recognized from my first life, the one 2 towns over, coincidentally. Not coincidentally at all, in fact, because I had made a single quiet phone call to that shop's owner 4 months earlier, a man who, it turned out, was well acquainted with Mr. Okafor, having bought stones from him for years, and who had been more than willing, for a modest referral fee and the simple professional courtesy of not wanting to be publicly associated with knowingly reselling a fake sapphire as genuine, to have a private word with whoever brought a piece in matching this description and appraise it honestly. Sasha frowned at the receipt, then at the photo, then said, with the particular cheerful bluntness of someone who does this for a living and has no personal stakes in the outcome, "Wait, this receipt says cubic zirconia. It's listed right here, see, CZ, white gold setting. That's not a sapphire. That's costume jewelry. I mean, it's a nice one, but this would have sold for like 40, 50 bucks tops, not 4,000. There was a silence. Not the textured silence from my first life, The one that came after Diane accused me of imagining a second ring. A different silence, brittle and public, made worse by the small red light on Chelsea's phone, indicating that all of this, Diane's face going through its slow collapse from confidence to confusion, to something closer to panic, Chelsea grabbing the receipt to read it herself, her mouth actually falling open, so was being watched, live by 11,000 people, several hundred of whom I happened to know because I had quietly followed the account for months, included members of Grant's extended family, 2 wedding vendors, and Grant's mother herself. "That's not possible," Diane said, too loudly. The way people say things when volume is standing in for certainty they don't actually have. "I sold that ring myself. I had it looked at." "By who?" Sasha asked. Not unkindly, just curious. The way you'd ask any question in the middle of a segment you didn't realize was about to blow up someone's life. Diane didn't have an answer to that because the truth, which came out slowly over the following weeks as I let events run their course, was that she had never had it properly appraised at all. She had matched the ring in the quilted box to the photograph in the 1987 document, assumed, because the setting and cut looked identical to Russell, because I had paid Mr. Okafor good money to make the replica identical, that it was the real thing and sold it fast to the first pawnbroker who'd take it without asking too many questions, because she needed the cash before the Cabo deposit deadline and didn't want to waste time getting a second opinion on something she was already a little uneasy about taking in the first place. I was sitting 3 feet away from all of this in a cabana chair, holding a mimosa, wearing my mother's actual ring on a fine chain tucked under my sundress where no one could see it. And I said nothing because I had learned this time that silence, when the truth is already doing all the work for you, is its own kind of weapon. That was the moment, the toast, the to Grandma Eleanor for finally being useful, landing not as the cruel joke Chelsea intended, but as a punchline to a story that had, unbeknownst to her, already ended badly for her 12 seconds earlier, live on camera, in front of her future in-laws. I want to tell you the rest happened instantly, in one satisfying cascade, but real consequences rarely move that fast. And I'd learned enough this time to let them unfold at their own pace instead of forcing a dramatic confrontation I didn't need. Grant's mother called Chelsea within the hour, according to Britt, who texted me the whole story blow by blow with an enthusiasm that told me she'd never much liked Diane either. The conversation was, by all accounts, brutal, focused less on the fake ring itself and more on the fact that Diane had spent months assuring the family that Chelsea's side was contributing meaningfully, using money that had, in reality, come from selling a piece of costume jewelry for less than a nice dinner out. That alone might have blown over eventually, the way most wealthy families' embarrassments eventually get smoothed into a story everyone agrees not to bring up again. What made it unrecoverable was the second thing, the thing I set in motion 2 days later, once I was certain the ring story had already done its damage and I wasn't simply piling on for its own sake. I sent Gerald the file. Not dramatically, not as a confrontation. I drove to his house on a Tuesday afternoon while Diane was still in Cabo doing damage control, and I sat with him at the same kitchen table where he'd once offered me his garage, and I told him, gently, because some part of me still loved him, still remembered him teaching me to parallel park in an empty church lot when I was 16, that I'd been helping him organize his retirement statements for tax purposes, and had noticed some withdrawals that didn't match anything he'd mentioned. And did he want to go through them together? He did not know. That was the part that broke something in his face, watching him realize it in real time, page by page. $61,000 over 3 years, home repairs that were never made, a down payment for Chelsea that Chelsea's own condo paperwork, which I had also quietly obtained a copy of months earlier through a records request, showed had actually been financed conventionally with no unusual lump sum payment matching Diane's withdrawal dates. Gerald did not yell. He is not a man who yells. He went very quiet, the way soft-spoken people sometimes do, right before they make the hardest decision of their lives, and he asked me to leave him alone for a while. And I did not hear from him again for 11 days. When I did hear from him, it was a short, formal email informing me that he had filed for divorce, and that he wanted me to know he was sorry, genuinely sorry for the ring, for not asking harder questions the first time Diane brought it up, for a lot of things he didn't specify, but that I understood anyway. Chelsea's wedding did not happen on schedule. It didn't happen at all, as it turned out, though not entirely for the reasons you'd expect. Grant, it emerged over the following months, had been quietly uneasy for a while about a pattern in Chelsea's spending and a certain instinct she had for stretching the truth when it suited her, an instinct the fake ring incident illuminated in a way he apparently couldn't unsee once he'd seen it. They didn't have some cinematic public breakup. He simply, slowly stopped moving the wedding planning forward, and 6 months later, Britt told me over coffee that they'd quietly called it off, that Grant had said something to a mutual friend about needing to marry someone who told him the truth, even when it cost her something. Chelsea called me once, but about 10 days after the video, in a voice I'd never heard from her before, stripped of the flat, performative confidence she'd always carried like a second skin. She didn't apologize, not exactly, but she asked quietly whether I'd known, whether I'd somehow arranged it. I told her the truth, or a version careful enough to still be the truth, that I'd had the real ring appraised and protected months ago because after everything with our mother, I wasn't willing to leave anything of hers unguarded again, and that whatever had happened to the ring she and Diane found in that box wasn't something I'd had a hand in. Both of those sentences were technically entirely accurate. I let her sit with the rest of it herself. He keeps asking me why I let Mom handle everything, she said, meaning Grant, meaning his family, meaning the particular flavor of scrutiny that comes from marrying into people who measure trust the way accountants measure a balance sheet. I didn't know about the retirement thing. I swear I didn't know. I believed her, mostly. I think Chelsea had spent so many years benefiting from Diane's arrangements that she'd simply stopped asking where the money came from. The way I'd once stopped asking why every family gathering seemed to end with me a little smaller than when it started. That didn't make her innocent. It made her, I think, a particular kind of casualty of the same household that had made me one. Except she'd been raised inside its logic instead of outside it, absorbing it instead of surviving it. I didn't offer her comfort. I also didn't hang up on her, which surprised us both. We talked for 11 minutes, mostly silence punctuated by small, careful sentences. And at the end of it, she said, in a voice so quiet I almost missed it, "I shouldn't have said that thing about being useful." And I said, "No, you shouldn't have." And that was the last real conversation we've had. We're not close now. I don't know if we ever will be again, but it wasn't nothing, and I've stopped needing it to be more than what it was. Gerald, for his part, sold the house 8 months after the divorce finalized, a house I'd eaten 1,000 dinners in as a teenager, and moved into a smaller condo across town with a single bedroom and a kitchen too small for anyone to hide financial paperwork in, even if they wanted to. He calls me now on Sundays, a habit that started awkwardly, both of us unsure what we were rebuilding or whether it was worth the effort, and has slowly become something neither of us questions anymore. He asked me once, carefully, almost afraid of the answer, whether I'd ever be able to forgive him for not asking harder questions the first time. I told him I already had, mostly because I understood better than almost anyone could how easy it is to let someone you love handle the parts of life you don't want to look at closely, and how expensive that particular kindness can turn out to be. Diane, as far as I know, moved to a different state to live near her sister. I don't keep close tabs on her. I heard through Britt, secondhand, that she still tells a version of the ring story at parties, one where she's the wronged party, deceived by an untrustworthy pawnbroker, and I find that I don't feel much of anything when I hear that, which is its own kind of victory, I think. The particular piece of no longer needing someone to admit what they did in order to know with total certainty what actually happened. I want to be honest about how all of this made me feel, because I think stories like mine sometimes skip past the complicated part in favor of the satisfying part, and I don't want to do that here. I did not feel triumphant exactly watching Chelsea's engagement dissolve or Gerald's marriage end. I felt something quieter and heavier, closer to grief than victory, because even in a story where I finally protected myself, I was still watching a family come apart, a family that had, for all its cruelty, also been the only one I had left after my mother died. But I did feel, underneath that grief, something that had been entirely absent from my first life: peace. Not because anyone was punished exactly enough, not because the math of it balanced out to some satisfying zero, but because I had, for the first time in either version of my life, refused to let people who did not value me decide what happened to the things I loved. The real ring never left me the entire time. I wore it on that chain under my collar through the whole unraveling, the way my mother used to wear it in her last months, close and quiet and entirely mine. And every time Diane or Chelsea said something cutting in those final confrontations, I could feel it there against my sternum, warm from my own skin. A small specific reminder that they were fighting over a story that had already ended, one they simply hadn't been told the ending of yet. 6 weeks after Gerald's divorce was finalized on a gray, ordinary Saturday with no anniversary attached to it, no reason at all except that I finally felt ready, I drove out to the cemetery where my mother is buried, on a hill that gets good light in the mornings, near a maple tree that turns the exact color of the sapphires setting every October, though I don't think that's why she chose the plot. I think she just liked the tree. I brought a small stainless steel keepsake capsule I'd bought months earlier, waterproof, designed to be interred, the kind funeral homes sell for exactly this purpose. And I brought a shovel, and I brought the ring, off the chain now, held loosely in my palm the way she'd once closed my fingers around it with both of her hands. I want to tell you I said something profound while I knelt there in the grass beside her headstone. Some perfect closing line that tied the whole story together, but the truth is, I mostly just talked to her the way I always had, ordinary and unguarded. Told her about the divorce, about Chelsea, about the fake ring and the live video and the $61,000, and somewhere in the middle of all that talking, I realized I was crying, finally, the way I hadn't let myself cry in either of my two lives. Not out of grief exactly, more out of the specific relief of finishing something you started a very long time ago and almost didn't get the chance to finish right. I dug a shallow space beside the base of the headstone, not disturbing anything, just enough for the capsule, and I put the ring inside it. And before I closed the lid, I held it one more time. Cornflower blue, catching the gray morning light exactly the way it used to catch the lamp in our old kitchen when she'd spin it while she thought. I thought about Josephine, a woman I never met, buying a jewelry store in 1911 when the world had 100 reasons ready to tell her she couldn't, and I thought about every hand this ring had passed through since. All of them women who'd had to fight, in one form or another, to keep something of their own intact. I understood, kneeling there, that the fighting had never really been about the object itself, not the stone, not the setting, not even the money it could be pawned for in a hurry. It had always been about whether the women in my family got to decide for themselves what happened to the things they loved, or whether that decision would keep getting made for them by whoever was standing closest with the most convincing excuse. Then I closed the lid and buried it and packed the earth back down and sat there a while longer with my hand flat on the grass like I was holding hers. It's been 4 months since that morning. I don't know exactly how the rest of my life is going to unfold, whether some version of it holds a daughter of my own someday, who I'll tell this whole story to, standing at that same hill, though I hope it does. What I know is that the promise is finally kept, the one I broke without meaning to the first time around, the one that cost me, my family, my peace, and eventually my own heart in the most literal medical sense there is. She told me 6 days before she died, don't let this become a family conversation, and if something happens to you, bury it with me. I spent an entire lifetime not understanding what she meant by that, mistaking it for a request about jewelry when it was really a request about protection, about never again handing something precious to people who had already shown you in 100 small ways exactly how carelessly they'd spend it. I got a second chance most people never get, and I used almost all of it just to get back to the one thing she asked me to do the first time. The ring is exactly where it belongs now, in the ground beside her, safe from bachelorette parties and quilted boxes and every version of Diane's smile that I now know, without a shadow of doubt, was never warmth at all. I go back to that hill sometimes, just to sit. I don't bring flowers, mostly because she never liked cut flowers, said it felt like watching something die twice. I just sit and I put my hand flat on the grass over the spot where the capsule is, and I tell her every single time the same 3 words, the only ones that ever really mattered in this whole story. I kept it safe.